Lead balloons.
Lead balloons.
The alchemy of unpopular opinions.
Unpopular opinions.
Yeah, I feel a little spicy today, so all bets are off.
And I know that you're out to get the ladies.
We're not encouraged to think critically.
Life is hard. It's supposed to be hard.
Oh my god. That's hilarious. Busted.
All right. Hello, everybody. And hello, Joel. How are you tonight?
Doing well here in Dallas, Texas.
And I am here I'm in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm mobile tonight. Visiting some friends here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So going to be doing the recording from here. So this is fun. And
that's my old stomping ground, old T-Town.
It's both of our stomping grounds, Joel. Yeah, absolutely. So welcome to another episode of Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. And we're glad that you're, wherever you are out there, you're listening to us, watching us. And hopefully it should be a really interesting discussion tonight, because tonight's topic is the path of a resident philosopher. And that refers to our very own Joel Triska tonight, who's going to be starring in this show. So, Joel, you and I were both once darling children of the church. And now both of us are kind of at least an arm's length away from involvement in the church. So today what we're going to do is we're going to track your intriguing path from training for the pastorate, then serving as a pastor, and now figuring out what life looks like post-pastorally. And the way that we're going to go about it, there's going to be really this conversation is going to be organic tonight, but kind of want to go into kind of three stages here. The first is going to be the call. We're going to talk about sort of how you became a pastor and what that experience is like, and a little bit of, obviously we're going to talk about being a pastor. And then we're going to talk about the conundrum, which is going to have to do with when like doubt started creeping in, these kinds of things. And then we are going to talk about, it's going to be a section called post-mortem. I want to talk about a way forward, what life looks like post-pastorally for Joel. So let's go ahead and then get started, Joel. Before we delve into your calling as a pastor, I want to preface things by sharing with people kind of the importance of this concept of the call or calling in the charismatic world that we were both a part of. Calling is really important for Christians in that world. In that the calling refers to vocational calling, a calling to the ministry, a sense that God has like a specific plan for your life, and it's up to you to sort of discern what that is. And for a lot of people, they would use language like hearing God's voice, having dreams, visions, having sort of that inner direction of the Spirit. It was something we sought after. It was something that we all wanted, and to varying degrees felt like we had that moment in our lives. So I want to, with that as sort of a context, I want to ask you, Joel, how did you start sensing an interest in pastoral ministry? Because you got into it at a young age. You're very active in church. How did you start sensing an interest in pastoral ministry? And did you have a moment when you sensed that God was calling you to do that kind of work?
Yeah, the phrase, or I guess not phrase, but faith tradition that specifically impacted me is called Pentecostalism. And just a little context for those who are not familiar from the Pentecostals, you probably know them from watching documentaries about weirdos speaking in tongues. But I grew up in that, and most of the people were not weirdos. They were beautiful people. And I just want to say that up front. But the history of Pentecostalism is pretty anti-intellectual. These are mostly early 1900s. These are mostly people that were not formally educated, and so deeply tied to evangelistic kinds of efforts. And so the whole thing, there was this almost urgency to send people out as missionaries to get as many people saved as possible. So fast forward up until the late 80s, when I'm a teenager, And I can remember going to a youth camp and there'd be a huge altar call for teenagers who felt called into the ministry. And it was basically just recruiting tactics for, using emotionalism for a bunch of 15 and 16-year-olds who did not have fully developed brains. And so I found that looking back, I find that to be pretty manipulative and and there's some question as to the validity of that. And most people that I knew that went down to those articles, it was a flash in the pan kind of emotional decision that never stuck. I never went to any of those altar calls, although I do have a very deep memory. I was so involved in my church, and I was kind of the golden child, like you kind of talked about. I can remember being down in an altar call on a Sunday night. Only the real Christians went to church on Sunday night, and I was down at an altar call, and I was down there praying, as we would say, the old timers would say, tarrying for the Lord, just waiting on the Lord and praying fervently. And one of the deacons came up, put his hand on my shoulder. He led the evangelistic movements and taught my evangelism classes, and just a beautiful man. But never went to college and had a deep passion to get people saved, and was trying to talk to me about, like, Joel, what are your plans? And at the time, I think I was a junior in high school, and I'm like, well, I'm going to go to college. And he says, Joel, have you considered the Lord's coming back? So doesn't it make sense to maybe go to a year of Bible school or 2 years at max and get out there so that we can get as many people saved as possible before the Lord comes back?
Wow.
And, even then I can remember just kind of like, I don't think my parents would be okay with that decision. And I mentioned to my mom was like, anyway, she didn't cuss, but she'd be like, F no. All right. Like, I graduated top 1% of my class in, a class of over 1,000. She's like, you are not doing that. You're going to college. And at the time I thought I was going to be an architect, because it was just very logical for me. I took 2 AP classes. I had AP Calculus and AP Art, and I was really good at both. And so I was like, art and math, I'll be an architect. They make money, right? Then I sent my ACT scores out to a couple architecture schools, but I had one more I could send to. And both my parents went to Oral Roberts University, where we both met. And so I said, I'll just send it there. I'm not going there. But I got a high enough score that they invited me to some like recruiting dinner. We lived in the same town, Tulsa. So I went with my dad to this recruiting dinner. And there was something about that time where I was so involved in my high school, so passionate about my faith. It was just like, it wasn't an emotional decision. It was, emotions were involved, but it was like a logical decision. It was just like, I've been poo-pooing on this idea of pastoral ministry. I've been poo-pooing on this idea of going into the ministry because I felt like my intellect was above what I was seeing in my own churches. I was like, these are people that aren't good at school. They're the ones who become youth pastors.
Yeah, right.
And that is not the opinion I hold now about anyone who is a youth pastor out there. So, by the way, but at the time that I had that kind of like young arrogance. And when I went to that recruiting dinner, something in me was like, I've been running from this. This actually makes a lot of sense for me to pursue this. And that I made a quick pivot, and I put my application in there. I got I declared to be a New Testament major, which is in theology, but focusing on more the academic side of things. And I got a writing minor because I knew it's like, hey, if this doesn't work out, I can teach English or whatever. So that's kind of like how that all played out for me. What about for you?
Well, I was often frustrated. I think in high school youth group, there was a big emphasis on, actually, there was a huge emphasis on finding your calling. And in particular, that calling was mostly valid when it was directed toward pastoral ministry. That was seen as a superior thing to do with your life.
Everything else is brown belt or below.
Exactly. And so I was desperately seeking a call from God and never really got it. But as I moved into university, I sensed more and more this desire as well as something like a calling. I never had a moment. There was never a moment where I heard God's voice or anything as much as I wanted that. But I did sense a heavy burden to do missionary work. And that's actually kind of what guided me through school, so that when I was at the end of my 4-year degree in English literature, I was planning to go work teach English as a second language in places where I sensed that people needed to hear the gospel. That's kind of how it was for me.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
And you did do that for a little bit, right?
And I taught English over in South Korea for a year in the preparation to do that kind of work. And then I decided not to do it. So, okay. So interesting. So not like a heavy emotional decision. It was just kind of the pieces came together for you. And really, I mean, it didn't seem like it was overthought or over deliberated, or it was just kind of came together for you. So we get to college, we had a 1 or 2 English classes together. And as far as I understand, you were fairly active in your youth ministry out in Broken Arrow. And maybe I could be wrong with that, but so you got into pastoral work. I think, was it right after college or during college that you were involved at Broken Arrow as in pastoral ministry? Because I remember after college visiting you at your office. I think it was where you were doing youth ministry. Is that right?
Yeah, I volunteered. That's the church I went to from the age of 1 all the way till when I left Broken Arrow at age 25. So I was leading worship there. I was doing all kind. I was every youth pastor's dream, because I was the perfect volunteer. I was so dependable. You could dump a lot of things onto me, and I would get a lot of things done. I wasn't the best musician, but I was capable and committed, and I led the band. And then when it came time, again, it was like another reoccurring experience. Like my senior year, I was looking at grad schools. Like I really had my heart set on going to like Cambridge or something like that. Because I was just reading a lot of C.S. Lewis at the time, and I just it's like Oxford or Cambridge. Well, I want to go over to study in Britain or Aberdeen or something like that. And so my youth pastor at the time was talking to me about he was moving into an executive pastor role and wanted to offer me the youth pastor role. And even when he offered it to me, I remember just kind of like, I'll think about it. But at the time, again, I didn't think it made sense for me. But then I was on a trip. I think you were there too when we were in Juarez for the mission trips leaders. I was leading a trip to London that summer, and we're down there working in the orphanage. And there was a moment where I was asked to speak at a high school, and I had a translator speaking in Spanish. And a lot of the feedback to me is like, you work so well with teenagers. You really speak. And then it was just a moment. It's like, why am I poo-pooing on this? This is something I'm clearly very good at and I enjoy. Why is it not okay for me to step into this and just feel it out? And so that's what I did. I became the youth pastor at the age of 22, a very large youth group, and I did that for 3 years.
Wow. So then you finished school, and it wasn't more than 2 or 3 years after we graduated that then you began attending seminary at Assemblies of God Theological Seminary in Springfield, Missouri. And, from the conversations I knew you all through that time, and we had plenty of conversations. And as far as I understand, that was a very positive overall experience for you. You learned a lot. You had some very good professors, some very interesting relationships developed from that. How formative was that time for you? And can you pick out any particular pivotal moment during that time where you shifted directions, or maybe it reinforced things for you, something that stands out from your seminary time that was very transformative for you?
There were really two. One relationship, well, I never had a class with him, but he oversaw the doctor of ministry, and he had kind of like within the Pentecostal circles what became known as the postmodern guy, because he was talking about cultural shifts in postmodernism. And I became really good friends with him and became very interested in postmodernism. Even as a graduate and student for one of my church history professors, he had me guest lecture in the courses on postmodern shifts in the church world. But one class that really impacted me was a theology of religions, which they're traditional ways to look at exclusivism, inclusivism, pluralism. And basically the question is, who can be saved? Is it only people who believe in Jesus?
Yeah.
Is it people who believe in Jesus, or they believe in like Jesus adjacent kind of things? Or is it like doesn't matter at all, almost like your universalism, or the question about salvation is an irrelevant question? And that question or that class was really formative for me because I just began to see the logic of a lot of these questions and the intellectual consistency of some of these questions that shown into light a lot of the intellectual inconsistencies of what I was being brought up to believe and how to interpret the Bible. I still like most people, some people take a class like that and it breaks them open, right? For me, I just kind of like I integrated it and I kind of held it in tension. I can hold things in tension for a very long time, Trent.
Yeah,
And
no,
so
you have a unique. I think you have a capacity that's even greater than mine with that. Something I've always been very interested in because you were somehow able to integrate the things that you were learning that might have been considered sort of non-traditional or funky, even as you were a certifiable Assemblies of God minister.
yep. Exactly. And I slowly would just and then people would say, "Oh, you can't be drop your credentials because you don't believe all of this." I'm like, "Screw that. You know, this is my family. Like I'll be
Right.
the one
Yeah.
that quietly like questions traditions in
Sure.
the corner. Yeah, everyone has a weird uncle in the family. I'll be that guy." And so I was able to kind of like still like bring along the baggage from the past and slowly
Yeah.
but surely drop little things along the way. Some people have to just like chuck the whole thing out and kind of reconstruct. So that was really formative for me. And then over my time as being a pastor, specifically building relationships with people who do not believe in traditional Christianity, that completely shaped the way I understood what I was taught. You can't love people who are different and not begin to see why their differences are so lovable.
Yeah. I think this is where you and I diverge a little bit in the way that we've handled our experiences in Christianity, because I think what my tendency is, I would embrace something really wholeheartedly and very fanatically, and then gradually begin to like, there would be distance and there would be this great conflict and explosive moment where I would just like then move in the other direction. You were able to sort of juggle these things and integrate it. You're like in this river, and then occasionally the river would diverge and come back together. So I thought that's really interesting. I want to ask you about, especially for people who don't know a lot about, maybe have never been involved in the church world, or even people who have but just don't know about this. What is it? Could you say something about what makes pastoral work unique and how it's unlike any other? Obviously it's going to be, you have to go to work, you're managing people, these kinds of things. What makes pastoral work unique from any other job?
I mean, that question will show up differently. I mean, I would have answered that question differently 10 years ago than I would today. 10 years ago, I might regurgitate some of the stories I was told about the sacredness of this position, the sacredness of being a clergy, about this call from God, about there being some sort of mantle that you wear. All these are like biblical, imagery that being pulled from. You're anointed, whatever. I see all of that as utter bullshit. It is human stories to prop up human personalities, and sometimes that works out all right. I think insecure egos need really large egos to be attracted to. And so that would often show up, especially in the church world and in particular the Pentecostal tradition. But now I kind of see there is still, I would acknowledge, some uniqueness about it that is good, and some that is, a little sketchy. The good parts, it's basically it's a helping profession. Just that you might see a counselor, you might see a nurse, you might see any of these kinds of professions where it is designed to help people. That is what you're doing. It does get a little sketchy because it's generally not, there's very unclear boundaries about where your job starts and where your job ends. And there's not like an organization that paints those boundaries really clearly for you in terms of when's your workday start, when's your workday end. I clearly worked every weekend because Sundays are like the big day.
Mm-hmm.
And then secondly, there's also kind of this expectation to kind of sacrifice yourself. Now, that is not unique to pastoring. I've seen counselors do that. I've seen nurses do that. I've seen parents do that, right? The stories we tell ourselves about the importance of this position, this call that I have, makes us like become martyrs for that story. And I personally never did that. I always had just kind of a real commitment to work-life balance. And but I think this, if you just kind of talk amongst people who are post-pastoral, you'll see a lot of burnt out individuals who felt like they had to give all their very all, and then found out that most people didn't appreciate it.
Yeah. So you ended up moving to Dallas, and after seminary, and you moved to Dallas, and you started pastoring a church in the Deep Ellum neighborhood or district down there in Dallas, which is in an urban multicultural environment. And previously you're in Broken Arrow, which is a very different demographic. And in Springfield, Missouri, a very different demographic, of course. Not as a more homogenous demographic. So you get to Dallas, and you're in a very different environment, which must have taken adjustment. What was the adjustment like, and what are some of the things that you're glad that you learned being in the environment that changed you?
I'm so grateful. I mean, even while I was there, a couple of years into it, the faith community that we were building there was very non-traditional. And it was a building. The building was not a church. The building was a cultural center that operated in the neighborhood to serve it. And then we had a faith community at its center that obviously funded a lot of it. And we had a coffee shop. We had all kinds of things. So relationships was really important because we were in a neighborhood that was kind of bohemian, that was kind of anti-institutional in general. So we would have churches come down and visit us to kind of see what we're doing, to study the innovation that we were doing, to connect with people. And I would tell these pastors, I'd be like, Deep Ellum, which is the neighborhood we were in, discipled me. Like, I'm not discipling them. They discipled me. It's being in relationship with chronically homeless people and seeing them as human beings and learning their stories. It's sitting around, hanging out with people, in the neighborhood who won't trust me unless I'm willing to have a beer with them. Because that to them just told them that I'm not taking myself too seriously. And that was really important. It's connecting with advocates and advocates for the neighborhood, or activists in the city around social justice issues, whether it's racial reconciliation. And Dallas has a very icky history with racism. And so like coming into those spaces and learning from people who are not only have lived experience, but have a ton of like life experience fighting for the things that they believe in. And I was not exposed to those kinds of things in a place like Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. And it was really impacting for me.
Very interesting. So in many ways you were fairly well adapted to the situation that you were in, and you had found ways to, like, use the word, integrate your experiences in the Assemblies of God, which is a hyper conservative denomination, but retain that identity and then assimilate into working in Deep Ellum, which I could never pull off, and that's a unique skill and disposition that you have. But okay, so there's obviously a trajectory here, though, because in other discussions that we've had, where I've shared my story, you've also acknowledged that you would still more or less identify. You wouldn't be bothered by being identified as a Christian, but you've also maybe happier with terms like mysticism, and being a little bit outside that. So what happened to get you? Maybe I can ask the question this way. You identified in your position not necessarily as a pastor, but as a resident philosopher. Why was that important to identify that way? And can you tell us about what kind of things happened in your spiritual journey that moved you away from a more traditional orthodox posture into a more open-minded or a more unconventional way of approaching your faith?
Great question. The Resident Philosopher thing was, I was tired. I just don't like traditional shit. Honestly, I think, in some cases, I actually like looking back and like bringing into history, bringing in rituals, bringing in traditions. I always want to give them a new spin because my personal view is liturgies are important, but they need to be given new life. Like liturgies, when we tactilely, is that a word? Do things.
Yeah,
whether
sure.
It's repeating something, lighting a candle, doing some sort of like pilgrimage. They need to be brought in some sort of fresh new life that feels relevant to the life I'm living. And I think that's what makes things experientially impactful. So that being said, I generally hated titles around like Pastor so-and-so. So it's just like, stop that. It's Joel. Like, to me, all those titles are really about ego and not about, and my job as a pastor is to help people, is to lead the way in like letting go of my ego. Why would I'm sabotaging my own efforts by asking people to call me by titles. If my actual efforts are to help people grow and to become their fullest potential selves. And the truth is, not a lot of pastors are interested in that because it's threatening to them. Okay, so that being said, I chose Resident Philosopher because it's really resonated with me. Like, I love philosophy. That's, I think, one of the reasons you and I are friends. We love to talk about Kierkegaard or whoever, but I also just love to look at the question why. Like, why are we doing this, and who is this serving? And so, with that being said, I'm always doing that with all of my theology, and I was very fortunate to have a smaller faith community that tend to attracted more artistic and creative kinds of people. They might have been attorneys or architects or what other kinds of vocations, but their heart, their kind of the way of viewing the world was more curious. And so because we had a faith community that was more like that, I got away with a lot of things. I could say things in my sermons that would have split churches in other places, but it was just a typical Sunday over there, and that was so fun for me, and it brought evolution. I got to challenge things like the Apostles' Creed, which was our statement of faith, but I got to challenge like things like virgin birth. I'd be like, why does that matter in the first century? All the gods were born of virgins. It doesn't, like Augustus Caesar was supposedly virgin born. It's like, it doesn't mean to them what we think it means. So I got to challenge these kinds of things and ask people to really develop a faith that wasn't Velcro to doctrine. And so for me, I was always kind of like evolving past the community and taking them to the place that I was probably 2 or 3 steps behind me. And that was really helpful for me.
Yeah. Well, you had really, gosh, you were pastoring or leading that church for 10
years.
plus years, 12 years. Okay. And I mean, that's quite a long stint at one church. And you, I think, have been then you had it was some challenges at that church. And Joel, you're for people who don't know, you're no longer at that church. You're no longer in pastoral ministry. So, I mean, I want to open up the floor for anything you might want to say about how that wrapped up and how you've made the transition onward. And then I want to get to a post-mortem, like what life is looking for you after. Is there anything that you want to say about sort of moving on into the next phase of your life and what you learned and what that experience was like?
First, it was fucking brutal and the most painful thing that I've ever gone through in my life. And I'll get to that, talk about that a little bit more. but it was necessary for me to evolve. My soul was trying to, this is the way I would say it. My soul was trying to evolve, but my ego was still holding on to attachments of that community, of stories about myself with that community. And it was like the scene in The Mission with Robert De Niro trying to carry up all the pull up all that big bag full of metal armor, whatnot. You know what the scene.
It's one of my favorite
about.
movies. Of course, I know exactly what you're talking about.
He's dragging it up the mountain, and the indigenous person comes behind him and takes the knife and cuts it off him. Of course, for him, it represents like guilt and penance, but for me, it represented attachments to things that were actually pretty good, but not serving me anymore.
Right.
And we had one major transition in the faith community, maybe 3 years before I stopped working there, where we transitioned what was traditionally a Pentecostal conservative faith community into fully inclusive LGBTQ members. And
wow.
And we lost a good amount of people, but we sat down and talked with everyone. I explained the scriptural interpretations of, I would always say that the way I got to this interpretation is because I learned how to read the Bible more Jewishly. And I don't know if you knew this, but Bible was written by all Jews. And so just like trying to get people to like throw them off and to really to like consider that there's what love looks like. And that shook a lot of people's confidence in me when that happened. And then what ended up, and I only want to make a brief reference to this, but I went through a divorce, and that's really at the crux of why I no longer work there. And there were a lot of people that I trusted through that process. It was a messy divorce. The board got, in my opinion, overly involved in that. My ex-wife was also one of the co-pastors. We went to seminary together, so it was just people began to take sides. The board began to like scapegoat a bit, and I only say all that because that's when I began to realize, all this energy that I'm putting into like trying to get people to keep liking me isn't working anyways. They're choosing to reject me regardless of what I tried to do here. So why try anymore? I'm just going to start believing what I actually believe instead of giving the sanitized version that I believe you're ready for. And so that began to shift for me, and I began to like move into new fields. Now, it was scary as hell. It felt like dying. I mean, I feel like I know exactly what Jesus means when he said, if you want to find yourself, you're going to have to lose yourself, because there was a real ego death that happened for me, and continues to happen as I work through some of the trauma of that experience.
Your life is very different. I mean, a lot of continuity in a lot of ways, but I mean, you still wear a lot of the same hats in your life, but there's quite a bit of discontinuity as well. How have you been able to make sense of your life post-pastorally, and how have you framed things so that you can move forward in a way that's exciting, in a way that's life-giving?
Well,
the answer doesn't have to be positive. I'm curious about how you're framing your life and sizing things up now.
Some of it isn't positive, and I still struggle with a lot of resentment, and getting back into therapy and having to deal with things that I cognitively know are not true about myself, and not even true about some of the other people. My brain wants to blame shift. My brain wants to do all kinds of judgmental sorts of things that human brains try to do. And so I'm trying to once again, detach from that story, so that, again, that's just the ego's sneaky way of trying to get in there and take control again. But I don't want to speak about the negative things as much as the positive things. Like, I have a new partner now. We're engaged. She's Indian. She grew up Hindu, but she has kind of a similar kind of tension with her religious upbringing, and our paths align from completely different soils, but the stalk is growing in the same direction. And so that's been really grateful. I've been very grateful for that experience with her. I'm still a father, and I get to like share my wisdom and my heart with my children. And in my career right now, there's skills that I get to do, but I miss like some of the deeper heady stuff and the thinking about, which is why you and I had started having conversations. I'm like, Trent,
right.
What if you and
Yeah. Well, I do think that's one of the really fun parts of life. I've been thinking about this, as I was driving out to Tulsa. I'm here visiting friends, and then going to be in Missouri visiting family and more friends there. And, one of the things I was thinking about as I was driving was that, life happens in very unexpected ways, and there's really awesome things that happen, and there's really bad things that happen. But when major transitions happen, you odd times have a sense you don't imagine that there's going to be great things that happen. That there are horizons that open up very unexpectedly when you go through a kind of a traumatic, very stressful experience, and you can't predict what's going to happen. And a lot of times, very obviously awful things. It doesn't always come out good, but sometimes some really interesting things happen. You and I have reconnected. Obviously, we've stayed in touch all these years, but you and I have reconnected more frequently and intensely in the past like 6 months or so. And the nature of the conversations that we're having now are specific to the transitions that we've made in our lives. It would not have been possible had we not sort of shifted gears. So it's a really interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, and I find our conversations now so life-giving for me. I used to be able to like noodle on these things and present creative ways and bake in humor and stories that make people feel, and like I used to be able to do this on a weekly basis. And Now I'm just like, I don't get to do any of that, and I miss it. I feel like it's a muscle that's trying to atrophy. So I'm grateful to like flex it with you.
Yeah, good. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Is there anything, I'm not a huge fan of like, major regrets and all this kind of stuff. But if you could go back and redo, a pastoral life, is there any ways that you would have done it differently, or do you feel pretty good about the journey that you went on, the risks that you took, and these kinds of things?
Yeah, I don't have a ton of regrets when I talk about like my theological evolution and my vocational like journey, because I always felt like I've been willing to like push. And a really deep value of myself is authenticity. So if I'm like evolving, that's going to show up. Now, I'm not going to like express it with, I think it's really when some pastors get up and say, I believe this differently now, so this is the direction we're going. I feel like that's really not very caring, because this is a community of people that it's not about what the pastor believes. It's about like the collective trying to go together and move together. So I would often like just kind of like push the envelope in a couple different ways, whether it's about like helping a bunch of white people consider what systemic racism looks like, or like it might be like helping people who grew up Baptist believe that, hey, the Bible, Father, Son, Holy Bible is what you believe in. How about let's invite in a little mysticism with the Holy Spirit, and not everything can be explained through the book of John. And so I love to be able to push on those things. And so now I feel like when I look back on it, it's like I was authentic. And when things broke open, it was when that rope got cut off of Robert De Niro climbing up the mountain, I began to like just sprint. And now I feel like I'm in a space that's much more like, I feel like self-expression is much more much more free. But I totally miss that community, man. Like, it feels like an aching. Oh God, I just got a wave of emotion. It feels like an aching hole in me. That's how beautiful that place was for me.
Yeah, that's true, man. Yeah, and I think one thing that I would say, if anybody's like listening to this, who's on the real, if you're deeply devoted and religious and faithful and all these kinds of things, it's very difficult to hear stories like Joel's and mine of people who were a central part of the flock, and maybe even involved in like pastoring or discipling you. And you hear these stories, and it's very difficult to deal with. But one of the things that I always wanted people to know when I was sharing about my story of leaving the church and not having a place for belief anymore, that yes, I was changing, and yes, I was evolving, and I perceived it to be a very good thing. But it's very difficult for a lot of people to watch. But I was always desirous of people to be compassionate and to reach out and to assume the best and recognize that even though I was changing, that so much of me was still the same, and the heart and the desire to help people was still there. And a lot of times I think it was hard for people to believe that a great Joel or a great Trent was still there, because they had associated us with these faith traditions, and then we're not part of those anymore. And that was a hard thing to deal with, for sure.
I mean, I felt so much of that, Trent, when I stopped being pastor, and I had to come to grips with and this is what I believe, my experience is my experience. I'm generating it via the stories that I tell myself, and other people are doing the same. So the pain and disappointment that other people feel, it really has nothing to do with me. It has to do with the stories and the experience that they're generating for themselves. And what I began to feel, the story that I had is I'm so committed to authenticity, and like just regularly and consistently and intentionally pulling myself down off the pedestal for people to go like, I'm just a person who happens to have a couple degrees in the Bible. I'm a human being just like you guys, and and I hope to like step into this place of leadership, but that doesn't make me a better person, right? That just happens to be an area of expertise that I have. And so I just assumed like all these friendships, like deep friendships, places, I mean, the most intimate spaces I shared with some of these people. And then once this happened, the divorce happened, which was their disappointment of watching their pastors get divorced. And then me kind of be sent off with a little bit of a stain on his back. And the disappointment, I began to realize, they didn't have a relationship with Joel the human being. They had a relationship with an idea of Joel the pastor, which isn't who I was. That turned to smoke in front of their eyes, and they didn't know what to do with me anymore. And I thought I was losing all these relationships, but really I was losing a kind of an illusion that never was actually concrete. Now, there are still people that from that faith community who didn't see me in that way, and those relationships stayed. But for the most part, a lot of people just could not handle it. And there might be people listening now who I was their youth pastor, and I mean, I've officiated over 70 weddings. There might be people that I've officiated their weddings and all kinds of things for them who are listening to this, and just it's so painful to hear this person that they thought would lead them down the straight and narrow, becoming one of the liberals. He went Rob Bell on me, right? It's just these kinds of, but the truth is, like, from some of our other podcasts, Trent, I care about the truth.
Right. Yeah.
I'm really not interested in maintaining status quo. I have studied enough church history to know status quo hurts people in the long run, and I'm not a part of that. And I will not contribute to that. I will take all the data we possibly can get to help us move towards light and truth. And sometimes if you follow that hard enough, you end up finding yourself on the fringe.
Well, I think that's a really good place to actually bring it to a conclusion, because I had something else planned, a little quotation that I wanted to share, but I almost feel like it would be somewhat of a disjuncture right now. I think that's really well said, and unless you really insist on me sharing it, but
share your Alan Watts quote. It's Alan
okay.
Watts,
I'll
right?
share my friggin' Alan Watts quote, but The reason why this stood out, I love Alan Watts. The reason it stood out to me is because, well, I've used the term multiple times in this session of Joel's journey, and it's actually not a term that I like to use a ton because I think, well, it's kind of cliche now. So many people talk about a life in terms of a journey, and it's one metaphor that has some usefulness. But I really like what Alan Watts has to say, and I think it also sort of does a good job of bouncing off some of the things you've said tonight, because our lives aren't moving linearly. Obviously, we go from birth to death, but seeing it as sort of a unidirectional thing, I don't think is always helpful, or it's limited. So I want to share this, and then you can respond to it, and that'll kind of be our wrap. But this is from a lecture that he delivered, and he says, existence, the physical universe, is basically playful. There's no necessity for it whatsoever. It isn't going anywhere. That is to say, it doesn't have some destination that it ought to arrive at. But it is best understood by analogy with music, because music as an art form is essentially playful. We say you play the piano, you don't work the piano. Why? Music differs from, say, travel. When you travel, you're trying to get somewhere. One doesn't make the end of the composition the point of the composition. If that were so, the best conductors would be those who played fastest, and there would be composers who wrote only finales. People would go to a concert just to hear one crashing chord, because that's the end. Same way in dancing, you don't aim at a particular spot in the room. That's where you should arrive. The whole point of the dancing is the dance. So his metaphor is, instead of life is a journey, he compares it, and he says life is a dance. That it doesn't necessarily have a particular spot that you're supposed to end up at, but that simply the point of life is to dance the dance. And the reason I think that's interesting is because that when we can appreciate sort of the actual episodes that we go through in life, we're not constantly always trapped by thinking I was here and now I'm going here. It's where am I right now and what am I learning and how can I be fully absorbed in sort of the chapter in my life that I'm going through right now, and really drink this up instead of fixating on where I've come from, although it's relevant, and where I'm going, although we need to think about where we're going. But we're we're not great in the Western world at really being immersed in what we're doing right now.
And I would argue that the human brain likes to play with time, and it's very easy for us to step outside of the dimension that we're existing right now, which is the present, and we want to go back to the past, which is sometimes it can be glorifying and nostalgia, or it can be regret and resentment. Or we'll go to the future, and that can be fear and anxiety and worry. I call it fear casting, and I just get my brain just trying to worry about what's happening. And, there's that line about in the Gospels where Jesus says, "Don't worry about tomorrow; it has enough worries of its own." And he's kind of touching on the brain's capacity for that. Or I might be trying to fantasize about the future and escaping into some sort of unrealistic future where I have more money, or I have a different job, or I'm with a different mate, or people do all kinds of things with their brains. And it reminds me of the 12 steps saying that when you got one foot in the past and one foot in the future, you end up pissing all over today. I love that one. Yeah. One time I actually made a slide with a stick man, and then it had future, and then it just said today, and I just left it blank in the middle, but they filled in the gaps. That's the kind of stuff I got away with.
Well, Joe, I think we'll wrap up for this episode, but I really I want to thank you for taking the time to share a story that is at times very intriguing and celebratory and very interesting, but also painful and difficult because of how much time and effort and energy and blood, sweat, and tears you put into that, and for it not to be there around anymore is difficult. And hopefully we're writing a story right now that's a very intriguing sort of next chapter. And so thanks for sharing.
It all belongs. Thanks, man.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that is another episode of Lead Balloons, and thank you for being with us today.
Thanks, y'all.